I was shocked one time. I went to a talk. This was not even recently. This was 15 years ago. And I thought, oh, a bunch of my friends will be at this meeting and I'll hear some new stuff. So I drove down into New York State, which wasn't too far away. And the people from Penn State had done this study where they had put these traps on beehives. Some of them were commercial hives, some were hobbyist hives, but they were scattered out over a lot of eastern North America. And you put this trap on, and when the bees go through it, the grid is such that the pollen on the leg of the bee, a lot of it gets knocked off. So now you've got a sampling of the pollen that the bees have collected from a bunch of different plants. And you can take that in and you can then analyze it for pesticides. 106 different chemicals showed up in the pollens from that region, okay? All these bees.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, back today, we're going to talk about insects. We're going to talk about bees. We're going to talk about traveling. We've got entomologist, biologist, Professor Gard Otis down there at the University of Guelph up in Canada, Ph.D. How you doing today?
I'm really well. It's cold outside. No bees flying today, but the sun is shining and the ice is melting, so things are good.
Are you a beekeeper yourself? Do you keep bees somewhere?
I'm a terrible beekeeper. I'm actually terrible. I've gotten bees 3 times in my life, and every time I've ended up giving them up, mostly because they're dying or I don't look after them. Because part of it, most of my career, I was heavily involved with beehives and bee colonies. And at the university at that time, we had about 200 or more hives of bees that we were managing and working with. And the worst thing is to have your hobby be the same as your job. And the last thing I really wanted to do on the weekend was drive out in the country and hike across a field to check a colony and spend 3 hours doing exactly what I did all week long. So I was a terrible beekeeper. I love looking at them, and I love letting them do their thing and watching and learning and seeing what they do. But managing them and keeping them for honey production, I have a lot of respect for good beekeepers.
I couldn't do it either. The punctuality, you really got to know your stuff. But how did you? But you have.
They run your life. It's their schedule, not your schedule. So you have to bark when they tell you to bark. You have to bark and jump and go do the job.
So how did you get involved with bees as something that just you're generally interested in? How did you get? Did you always have a love for nature?
I always had the love for nature, and my biggest love was for birds, not bees. And I kept bumping into bees. I remember once as a kid seeing somebody stealing beehives down the road, and it turned out it was somebody moving them for pollination. And that was the first time I ever thought, wow, people keep bees in boxes and they pick them up and put them on trucks and move them away. And that was an eye-opener. And then I shared a house with a beekeeper toward the end of my undergraduate program. And helped him put beehive equipment together and got stung by bees a couple times. But it was still birds. And then I had a very influential summer when I went to help a guy with his research in Panama. He was studying these communally nesting bees. And after being there a year, he hadn't found a single nest. And he was trying to find 3 different species. So his project was just literally going into the tank as fast as you could chase it down the hole. And he was desperate. He was searching for a new Ph.D. project, and I was there with nothing to do. And I started getting interested in bugs and started collecting butterflies and beetles and all sorts of stuff. And I just got the bug bite. I just got bitten. And ended up applying for grad school to study butterflies. And I'd never actually taken a single entomology course in my life. So that was like a bit of a stretch. So I picked a school that had both a good vertebrate group and a good entomology group, and that happened to be the University of Kansas was where I picked. And it turned out that I love the bugs, and I realized very quickly that what I could do within my first project was working on these rainforest butterflies, and what I was able to do in about 8 months in the field in the rainforest with butterflies would have taken me about 12 years to do the same thing with birds. It's like, wow, I can pick them up, I can catch them, I can mark them. Nobody even cares if I pick them up and mark them like they do with vertebrates. And it was an eye opener that you could do all this stuff and manipulate them. Plus, they were like little creatures, and I don't like microscopic things because I love being able to see things, mark them, follow them, see what they do, all that kind of stuff. So, and then my advisor got funding to study killer bees in South America, and I was desperate to go back to the tropics. And so I figured, well, even killer bees in French Guiana sounds better than staying here at home in the States. So I signed on, and I had one of the funniest experiences. He had set out these little trap hives, and we were trying to move them into like little tiny beehives for study. And we went to this one box that we knew had been colonized. And he's up on the top of this little hill standing with the bees, and he's getting all this equipment ready. And I'm like, Gard, where are you? And I literally was down at the bottom of the hill, and my knees were knocking against each other. I don't think it's ever happened before or since, but it was like, those are killer bees. Like, I'm going to die. Like, this is not going to work. And then, of course, we went up and started doing everything. And it turns out once you knock the bees, like once you open them up and get their colony disorganized, any defense they would have just disappears. And they just became like little pussycats. We pushed them around. We put them in the beehive. We got everything done. And it was like, wow, these bees. And then you start to watch honeybees. If you watch them for any period of time, majority of people get grabbed by them. Like, they are captivating. Their societies are so complex. And of course, like any animal, you can't just ask it a question and get an answer. You have to design an experiment that the bees, through their behavior, will give you, or their responses will give you the answers. And I got the bee hooked by bees. So I was very, very lucky to get a job working with honeybees. And my dad, when I was studying butterflies, he knew that I was doomed. There was going to be no job for this son of his. No way anybody would study butterflies. And then when I started working on honeybees, he was like, thank the Lord. He's at least doing something practical. Yeah. And he was pushing me this kid needs a job. I mean, go to Union Carbide. They kill insects. You've got the experience and you can do this. Oh. And I actually wrote to Union Carbide. Like, I was desperate for a job, which would have been a really bad mix for me. So I was very, very lucky. I got into an academic job where I was able to follow my interests over time and study bees and whatever's happened since then. So yeah, that was my history.
And you seem like you're fairly sensitive, and you kind of like the creatures that you study. Is that right?
I do like them. I even like giant hornets. They're beautiful animals, and we got involved in some research with them a couple of years back, and it was one of those things where we're rambling around here, but I had met some people from Vietnam this was way back in 96. And I realized that the people in Vietnam had the bee community was better trained and better able to do beekeeping training type activities than pretty much anybody else in Asia. And I gave them a commitment in 96. I said, I will try to work with you to get a project to do some kind of beekeeping development work. It took 10 years before we got the project. And the project lasted from 2006 to 2013. So I was going to Vietnam back and forth once or twice a year and helping supervise this training program and training the trainers, and then going out to villages and teaching people how to keep bees. And when we would go there, we would see these beehives in the fall that had these spots all over the front of the hive. Well, I had the advantage of having been in Malaysia, I'd been in Indonesia, I'd been in the Philippines, I'd been many, many places, and I never saw spots on the fronts of hives. This was new for me. So I would ask, what is that? And for them, it was just normal. So they never thought about it. It happened every fall. The bees got spots on the front of the hive. So nobody knew what it was. But one beekeeper actually said, oh, it's animal dung. And I said, well, how do you know that? And he said, well, I watched the bee collecting manure on the road. And I did some searching on the web, and through literature search engines, I couldn't find any reference to honeybees collecting animal dung. I even wrote to a couple experts who I knew who would know if there's such a thing, and they knew nothing. So we were really lucky. On the basis of almost no information, we got some funding, and we went off to study bees and spotting behavior. And it turns out, lo and behold, although the bees are visited by a number of species of hornets, they seem to have the spotting behavior only in response to the giant hornets. And these are the so-called murder hornets that showed up a couple of years ago in Western North America that got lots and lots of press. And so we went into Vietnam to study these hornets. This was now 9 years ago. No, it was 10 years ago this year. I wrote to a friend of mine from grad school who studied hornets, and I said, well, these bees have a really bad reputation for killing people and like defensive responses that are huge. And what do I do to protect myself? And he said, in Japan, they wear hazmat suits. But he said, unfortunately, in Vietnam, you'll cook to death in a hazmat suit. So I really don't know what you're going to do. So we head off, just like me and killer bees. It's like, here I am with murder hornets, once again, headed off to certain death because we had no idea what we would experience. And it ended up that as long as they're visiting beehives and you're not at their nest, like a hornet's colony, they're pussycats. You can literally sit there and hit them out of the way with your hand and push them to the side of the hive. We had one hive that was getting attacked, and we wanted them to attack a colony 3 down the row. And so we just sat there and pushed them out of the way until they attacked the colony we wanted. It was, yeah. So, I have a lot of respect. And they're beautiful hornets. Oh, they're beautiful. They're really beautiful.
Yeah, they're amazing creatures. So you think some of the press is overblown about the killer aspect of these things?
They do kill people. And mostly it happens when, like, imagine a colony with 500 to 1,000 wasps that are 4 to 5 centimeters long. And they're nesting in the ground and you don't know they're there, and then you stumble into them. Mm. Yeah, it's not good.
Now, as far as wasps, hornets, bees, which one is the most aggressive in that way?
Africanized killer bees.
The killer is in the name. Okay.
Yeah. The ones I first went to South America to study, they're very sensitive to disturbance, and they're very quick to act, and they can act in mass, and they're very impressive.
What are we talking about as far as damage done? Venom of some kind? You die within 5 minutes? What's the deal?
If you're unprotected, like no suit, no veil to cover your head and your eyes, and you aren't able to quickly get out of the way, then you'll get a number of stings quickly, and the average person will then run away. Well, if you get confused or something happens and you can't run away, I don't want to go into details, but
sure.
But there are stories of like 40 stings per square inch, like, yeah, and your body, it's not a matter of like anaphylactic shock to like just an allergic reaction to the venom. It's your kidneys shutting down because of mass rupturing of blood cells from the venom.
Jesus Christ.
And the killer hornets or the murder hornets are kind of the same. If you got a lot of venom in your system, it wreaks havoc on your cells, and then the kidneys can't handle all the damage. We should change the topic.
Right. I got stung last year, and it was just a wasp and stuff, but they were in the ground and stuff. They came out and went right for the back of my head.
Yeah. Well, nice. Imagine that it had 5 times as much venom, and that you had 20 of them get you on the back.
I will not imagine that, sir. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Not.
So what?
But anyway, in the gist of it, just by following up on this simple observation of spotting and what it's led us to. Trying to understand the purpose of the spotting. Our first paper on it was about how we actually learned that the bees' use of dung to defend the colony falls into the category of tool use. And so it was the first example of honeybees using a tool that's been published. And the second paper, we were standing, my colleague Heather Matala, she was a grad student of mine, and she's an amazing behavioral biologist. And I was talking with our team, getting ready for our research for the day, and she was over standing near a beehive that a hornet had just visited. It's because these hornets will come into the apiary. They've learned that there's bees to be eaten, and they'll check out one hive, another hive, another hive. And then at some point they decide, oh, we're going to attack this. And then they coordinate an attack from their nestmates to come back and focus on that particular colony of bees. So a hornet had just visited, and she was over near the hive, and she said, Gard, come here, you got to hear this. And I go over and I'm like, hear this? What are you talking about? And I was about a meter away from the hive, and I could literally hear the bees sounding like they're screaming, all right? That's what we hear. Bees don't hear airborne sounds, but they do a lot of vibrations that go down through the comb and everything. And we're standing there looking at each other, and I said, and we both are like, what's that? And it's like, I guess we better study this. So we ran to town and bought some digital recorders and some microphones and hung microphones in hives. And we figured out that, we got all these recordings of hives with hornets and without hornets. And we had recordings with another kind of hornet that doesn't do the same behavior. And it turns out again that the response of the bees seems to be specific to that kind of hornet. They have a specific, what we call an anti-predator pipe that they emit in response to that kind of hornet. We can't absolutely say that, but the evidence suggests it. And then somehow that's coordinated in how the bees respond to the hornets and launch their defensive behaviors. And that's the piece of the whole thing that anybody out there, there's a PhD project.
If you know.
A project to be done.
Yeah. So that you could draw some conclusions or guess that it's some kind of messaging system between all of them, right? They would that's a way for them to tell each other like, oh, we're in a rumble now. We need to. Yeah. And I mean, there are other defensive techniques that the bees have that have been studied by others. Like one of them is to rush out and engulf the bee in a ball so tight that you can literally roll it from hand to hand with the bees not stinging you. And they raise their body temperatures up to above the lethal temperature for the hornet, and they cook the hornet to death. And that was figured out like more than 20 years ago. But add to that this sound production or vibration emission that they do upon the hornets coming. And there's some interesting stuff to be figured out in terms of what happens first and who communicates what to whom and how many bees are actually involved in collecting animal manure. If they're collecting it nearby, it doesn't take a whole lot of bees collecting manure before you start to have a lot of spots show up on the front of the hive. And if you have lots of spotting with these smelly substances, the hornets come and they spend less time at the hive. They spend a lot less time actually landed on the hive. And some of them will try to chew the wood to get in the entrance, and they spend about 1/10 as much time chewing at the wood, less than 1/10. So they actually are deterring the hornets through these smelly substances. Wow. And there's a bunch of stuff yet to be worked out on what the bees are, how they're coordinating all that, and who's doing what. Wow,
it'd be fun to do.
So, but you've got to study both sides of both teams. Are bees with their tool use smarter, or which one exhibits the most intelligence?
Well, I'm not sure there's a lot of intelligence involved. I think it's a lot of well-evolved knee-jerk reactions, if you will, that the bees and the hornets, and they get a stimulus and they respond to the stimulus if that stimulus is strong enough. And within that, you have different kinds of stimuli that can be enter into the system. You have different thresholds of response to like chemicals or to the acoustic signals. So there's a lot of things can be fine-tuned so that you get individuals or colonies that respond a lot and colonies that don't respond a lot. And they can be selected for over time if they show the proper behavior.
You could possibly poison a bee by playing him the wrong genre of music. He could just be like, oh, I don't like that. The response to vibrations, you said.
Some people have done, I don't know the details of it. There have been some studies of how bees respond to like Mozart music versus rock music. I don't know what the answer is, but I know that There have been some studies.
They're a little more graceful when they fly. Yeah.
Yeah,
We'll
that could
see.
be it.
I talked to a zoologist that orangutans, they hate music. Every time you try to play it for them, they go over there and turn it off. They
I read
tried.
that. That was the only interview of yours I watched, and I saw that. It was pretty funny.
Yeah, she's great. Oh, God, she's such a treat. Both anti-humanity biology, nerds. So what else has just really surprised you in all your research that, kind of took you by surprise or wasn't documented before? Throughout your whole career.
Yeah, no, I get that. I don't know that I can do that. I can answer that question. So I'm trained as a biologist, and I'm trained to try to look around at the world and see things and then ask questions. And those questions then become, another word for a question is a hypothesis. That's the background for what you're going to study or how and the way you ask that question really defines how you're going to study it and how you're going to go about getting the answer. There are certain things I personally can't do. I work with people who do molecular biology who can answer certain questions that I personally can't, because I never will do molecular biology. It's just, I would be terrible at it. Let's just put it that way. And same thing with chemistry. If I need chemistry, I'm going to have to turn to somebody else who I work with. But that's cool. There's lots of people who are willing to collaborate, and you get into collaborations that are interesting. So some of the questions I've asked are like the spotting on the beehive question turned out to be really, really cool. I had a feeling it was going to be really cool, and it turned out to be as cool as we thought, if not cooler. And some of the questions are really pretty small, like little things about, like there's a butterfly that's fairly scarce at the west end of Lake Erie on the islands and mainland nearby. And so one question was just, how scarce are they? Like that's a good study for an undergrad student to publish, which he did. It's not going to get me fame and glory and tenure or anything like that as a scientist. But so sometimes the question is, yeah, I'd like to know the answer to this. And, this will be good for a student at that level to launch their career. That same student now has his Ph.D. So it got him into research and got him excited, and he's moved on and he's building a career. So that's good. That was a good question in that I got the answer and it was beneficial for the person I was working with. My initial question way back was about these African bees in South America. The initial questions were, okay, these bees are expanding their range at a rate of like 300 kilometers a year, moving north from Brazil into where I was in French Guiana, and then on into Venezuela and up toward the United States. And with what we knew about honeybee biology, that wasn't possible. It did not fit what we knew about what honeybees do. So the question was, one question was, how is their behavior different that enables them to move that fast? And then another one was, okay, once they get to a place, they seem to become really abundant very quickly. And what is it about their biology that allows them to build up and become so common so quickly? And so that was my PhD research, and we answered those questions pretty well. And I'm very proud of the work we did with that. So
any dangerous moments down there in places? French Guiana, that's a really wild place.
At the time we were there, it was really wild. I looked it up. When my advisor said, don't you want to go to South America and study killer bees? My initial reaction was, who in their right mind would say yes to the answer to that question? Like, no, I don't want to do this. And at that time, there were very few travel books. So the big one for anybody for South America was called the South America Handbook. And all of South America was in one paperback book. And French Guiana covered 4 pages. And there literally was nothing there, which turned out if you're going to study killer bees out in the bush, this is a really good thing. You don't have a lot of people to contend with. And it turned out that there was a space center there. There still is. The French have their space center located because when you're near the equator and you're trying to launch a satellite, this Earth is literally spinning faster at the equator than it is up at the pole. It's when you're like this versus like this. Okay. So, they had formed this European Space Agency with Britain and Germany and France. And it was one of those classic things where I think the French built the first stage, and I think if I remember correctly, the Germans built the second stage, and maybe it was the British, and the Germans the third stage, and then the French had the payload. And in between the first and second stage, it failed. So the French pointed the finger at the Brits and said, it's your fault. And the Brits pointed the finger at the French and said, it's your fault. And the Germans said, we will not work with this. And out they went. And then the French said, we must make this succeed. So the French stayed in it, and it became the French Space Center. And so when we were there, they were at the point of trying to build the thing up to the point where they could start to launch satellites, but they were far away from that. So we actually had our beehives illegally on the Space Center land, but didn't really know it. Like, it was just empty countryside, right? And then about 3 months before we were due to, I was working with another grad student, we were due to leave to come home. We get the summons from the space agency. Oh, you need to come in and talk to us. So we go in, and they're like, do you realize you've got your bees illegally on our property? Oh, no, we didn't realize that. And so, well, you must move them. So it's like, well, could you just wait like 3 months? They've been there a year and a half, and nobody ever noticed them. So maybe you could just like wait 3 months. We'll leave, and somebody who follows us will move the bees. And they went, yeah, okay, we'll do that. So we finished off with what we did, and the next person that took up the challenge down there moved the bees, and so that was kind of fun. And then there was a French Foreign Legion post in town, one of the few that remained in the world, and we'd be out checking our beehives, and there'd be these guys in camouflage coming across the savannah with their guns and everything, coming toward us on one of their maneuvers. That was fun. That was interesting. And it was a very strange little community. At that point in time, we were told the biggest export from French Guiana was ice. And that was because there were shrimp grounds offshore somewhere. And the boats would have to come into French Guiana to get ice to go out and catch the shrimp and then take them off to wherever it was they took shrimp. I don't think they brought them back to French Guiana. They took them to Brazil or the States or something. And ice was like their biggest export.
Crazy.
There was nothing there. It was a wild place.
That's crazy. Ice. I never would have thought that.
Yeah, they're littered. And there was huge forest potential, but nobody was cutting down the forest. I don't know what's happened with that now.
Yeah.
Now the big issue is illegal gold mining. They're just pouring mercury all through the rainforest to extract gold from little bits of gold here and there.
Yeah, that's the other thing.
It's not, yeah. And that was a little thing when we were there. Like, we had a mechanic people would end up in French Guiana because of gold fever, but they had to make a living. So our mechanic was from Hungary, and he literally wasn't a mechanic. If your car had a problem, he brought this big hammer out. And he'd just start hitting things with the hammer, like, this will fix it. And then all of a sudden he'd disappear for like 2 weeks. And we'd say, well, where is he? Oh, he went into the jungle to search for gold. Oh, okay, he'll be back. So, yeah.
That's wild.
We're around here, aren't we?
Yeah. No, but this is great. These are the stories that actually make it all worth it, because I love to hear.
Well, one of the things in your questions you said you might ask, and I'll just lead the question. You asked me how my research and other activities how my different aspects of my career inform each other, how they help each other.
Oh, yeah.
And one of them was about what it takes to be a successful teacher. And so I thought about that some after you sent the message. And I thought, okay, I think things that make somebody a good teacher are, one, you have to have a bit of a sense of humor. Two, you can't take yourself too seriously. You got to be willing to accept that you got things wrong, or that you need to regroup, or, something went wrong. Three, I think you have to have a lot of empathy for the people you're working with, because these are young people who are, man, they were trying to work their way through the world, right? And I know when I was young, I made tons of mistakes. So they are too. So I would always probably err on the side of leniency, if you will. Sometimes they probably didn't deserve it. I'm sure I got lied to a number of times about why the assignment was late. And I was like, well, if you're lying, that's yours to live with. And it's not going to affect my life that much if you turn this paper in a week late. So, I can do it. I can go with that. Yeah. But in the classroom, we had a lot of fun. I actually came across a student at a coffee shop the other day. He walks past me and he says, hello, Professor B, or something like that. And I'm like, looked at this guy. I'm like, who is that? And I said, okay, who are you? And he told me his name. And as soon as he told me his name, it was this strange name that and I went, oh, I remember that name. I remember you. And then as I looked at him, I remember that face. And so we had a chat about what are you doing and everything. And he said, I really like that class. And so I went over to him afterwards. I said, so I hope you could tell that I had a lot of fun teaching that class. This was like an introduction to apiculture, beekeeping and bees. And he said, oh yeah. He said it was really obvious that you really liked your bees. And I said, that's good because I think that's important. I think that was really important. So one, I made it fun. And then two, we talked about some of these stories of things that happen. Well, those are all ways you teach, right? If you teach through stories, people remember stuff. If you just spew a bunch of facts at them, goes in and goes out, they don't remember anything. But if you tell them the story, they remember the story. And so, because I'd had a lot of experiences with bees in different settings and different kinds of bees and different countries and all that stuff, and I'd worked on a bunch of different kinds of aspects of bee biology, I could kind of bring it to life through stories, and it works.
Yeah.
Works really well.
I agree 100%. You have to make it fun if you're going to tell anybody anything, and they get attached to characters and scenarios and places.
And you have to try to build questions on exams, which is really hard if they're multiple choice. But you have to try to get to the point where you're not just looking for total recall of information, but you're forcing people to synthesize a little bit, to think and to integrate information.
In the hopes that they will eventually be creative enough to actually have innovations rather than just spewing, remembered facts.
Yeah. And I loved it when people would give me an answer that was like right out of left field that I never thought about. And then I was like, yeah, that works too. I never thought you could answer that question that way. That's great. I love that.
Yeah.
If the TAs mark it, they mark that instantly wrong, right? Because you didn't give them exactly the answer that's on the paper that's right. But it's like, and then sometimes they would complain and they'd say, well, what's wrong with this answer? And I'd read it and that's great. I love it. Yeah. I'll give you for that. So
I think if you're a good creative teacher too, you could get a wrong answer, but if it's creative, say, it's wrong, but I like it,
Well, yeah, you get partial credit for that.
Right. Yeah.
It isn't creative literature that we're teaching them.
Right. So yeah, other than that, I would talk about some of the threats that these our flying friends go through. What are some of the big things that we're supposed to be looking out for, and what role do they play in the biodiversity? Like, it's important, right?
Big questions.
Yeah.
So my job, when I got hired, a portion of my job was supposed to be to try to develop beekeeping in various parts of the world. In addition to that, I was supposed to do research, and part of my position was funded through the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture. So that research, some of that research has to be practical and has to relate to beekeepers. And then teaching, of course, I had teaching. So I always had a blend of sort of my general, just follow my brain and things I'm interested in kind of research versus some projects that would help the beekeepers in some way, shape, or form. And if you get into the beekeeping world, there's always some new pest or some new thing coming down the line. It's like, it's a constant through time. It's been something or other that's been a problem. This disease, this pesticide, different kinds of things. So part of my career, well, African bees was one of them. They've been introduced to South America. It looked like they were expanding their range very quickly toward North America. Eventually they got here, of course, to the southern United States. How big a threat is that? What do we do to mitigate that? So part of my research, even though it was fundamental research on bee ecology and colony behavior, it was still fundamentally trying to get to, can we stop this bee? Can we do anything about it? How's it going to affect things? And I got into mating biology partly because how do we worry about these European bees that are nice and gentle that where beekeepers are managing? And here we got these killer bees in the wild. Here's my hand. Killer bees in the wild that are going to be mating with them. And how are we going to manage that? Like, how are we going to keep our queen industry going in the United States? So even though I was studying basic mating biology, the driving question behind a lot of our minds was, how is this going to help us to deal with things when these African bees finally get here? So, but the big game changer was when this mite called the varroa mite showed up. We won't get into the history of it, but through a series of accidents, if you will, the mites moved from the Asian honeybee that was a benign relationship, didn't cause any serious problems in the colonies. It jumped ship and moved over into the Western honeybee's colonies, the bee that you keep in Europe and the bee that we keep in North America, and that's been transported all over the world, Australia and everywhere else. And once it got into those Western bees, then through the movement of beehives, queen bees, its own movement, everything else, it gradually has spread pretty much around the world. They're just now dealing with the early stages of its incursion a little north of Sydney in Australia. Finally got to Australia. I guess New Zealand is still free, but it's pretty much everywhere now where we keep bees. And it is a nasty little parasite. And if you think about parasites and their hosts, any kind of animal that lives with another one, you can think of different ways they interact, right? It could be a beneficial interaction. It could be a neutral interaction, or it could be a parasitic then, where the one is harming the other. And so within that, you have a little bit of parasitism that's not so bad, doesn't cause too much damage. And then you have like, holy shit, this is really bad kind of parasitism. And varroa mites fell into the latter category of the holy, you know what. So,
yeah. I think I had that one in Mexico. The one that just it's gonna kill you eventually.
That was Montezuma's mite. That was a different his revenge. No, that was different.
Right.
But so this mite is really hard on Western honeybees, and at least in the early stages of it getting into Europe and then getting into North America, literally, if you do not treat your colony somehow with some kind of a chemical, it's going to die. So now we've got beekeepers who were like the defenders of natural life and the natural way, and we don't like pesticides. And virtually almost every one of them is using pesticides to kill this mite inside the beehive. And that poses some interesting dilemmas. One, how do you make sure that those chemicals aren't moving into honey? And they do to some extent. So we have to keep residue levels below some safe level. And two, how do we design a chemical that's going to kill mites and not bees? Because they're different, but their basic physiology is pretty much the same. And so, and then we have the issue that the mites, like most pests, will evolve resistance to the chemicals that they're being treated with after a certain number of generations. You know, how long does it take? It might take 10 generations, might take 20, 30, 40, but invariably they're going to overcome the chemical, and then you need a new chemical. So this has been kind of the the treadmill that beekeepers have been on for now close to 30. Well, in Germany, I guess it's trying to think when they first got to Germany and Europe. God, it's been a long time now. It's closing in on 50 years, I think. So we're now at a point where there are some bees that are resistant to the mites, European bees that are resistant. I got involved with a researcher in France, Yves Leconte, to study some populations he had in France that seemed to be resistant to the mites. And the issue is that the colonies that are resistant tend to be relatively small. And beekeepers tend to like nice, big, whopping colonies that'll produce big crops of honey. So they're not very enthusiastic about accepting this smaller version of their bees that might produce less honey, even though they don't have the cost of controlling the mites, right? So there's a cost there, and all the deaths of beehives are massive because of these mites. So that's probably the big game changer. And then you have associated with that, the mites are biting the bees and sucking on the bees' blood, if you will. And as they do that, they transmit viruses. They move viruses into the bees. And some of these viruses are literally benign if they're on the outside of the bee, and they're lethal within a few weeks if they're on the inside of the bee. So we've got that going on. Then there's a gut parasite that was associated with the bees in Asia, the colony bee in Asia, that somehow managed to get into the Western world, and it's causing a lot of problems. And then we've got some nutrition problems because we have big agriculture with big monocultures. And bees, believe it or not, they don't survive well on just one kind of food. They need a blend of foods. We should know that from our own biology. You know, you don't survive on potato chips alone. And bees don't survive on canola pollen alone. They need different kinds of pollen to get the blend of amino acids and everything else they need to do well. So all of these things, the gut parasite, the nutrition, the pesticides, the mite, they're all hitting the immune system of the bee. They're all taking that, if you want to have a full cup of immunity, and each one of them is notching down the amount of immunity that the bee has left to fight off whatever. And so bees are hurting, like honeybees are hurting, in that they just literally are being besieged by a whole set of factors. And then the issue is that you can't even assume that like what's happening here in Guelph is the same as what's happening where you are in Germany, or even that what's happening in Germany is the same as what's happening in the Netherlands. You've got different bees, different mites, different ecology, different climate, different foods that the bees are eating, the pollen and nectar. And so it gets really complicated to try to come up with a solution, because there is no one solution, because each setting is somewhat unique to the situation that in the spot, in the place.
Right.
So it's a really tough nut to crack.
You've got
and what I can't fathom is that we know of at least 4, 5, 6, 7, I don't know, quite a few populations of bees that are resistant to the mite in different places. And sure, the mite that's in France, our bees, sorry, how do I say that? Just because you have a bee that's resistant to the mite in France doesn't mean if you bring that bee to Canada, it'll be resistant to the mites here. But there are a lot of resistance genes in all these populations. I can't believe that somebody hasn't taken all of these populations, brought them together, mixed them all up, farmed out these offspring to different settings to select for these mite-resistant bees and get beyond it. I'm not saying nobody has done it. There's been an effort here, there, different places in localized settings. But as a unified approach from, say, a beekeeping community of the United States, for example, we want to get beyond this mite. We're going to collaborate and work, and we're going to come up with resistant bees. That has never happened. And so the beekeepers keep piling the chemicals onto the bees. And I was shocked one time. I went to a talk. This was not even recently. This was 15 years ago. And I thought, oh, a bunch of my friends will be at this meeting and I'll hear some new stuff. So I drove down into New York State, which wasn't too far away. And the people from Penn State had done this study where they had put these traps on beehives. Some of them were commercial hives, some were hobbyist hives, but they were scattered out over a lot of eastern North America. And you put this trap on, and when the bees go through it, the grid is such that the pollen on the leg of the bee, a lot of it gets knocked off. So now you've got a sampling of the pollen that the bees have collected from a bunch of different plants. And you can take that in and you can then analyze it for pesticides. 106 different chemicals showed up in the pollens from that region, okay? All these bees. So I think the most in one single colony was maybe 13. But it was like a chemical soup, if you will. And you know what happens if you're treating humans for a disease and they're taking this drug and that drug. Well, pretty soon you got interactions of drugs, right? So we've got interactions of these chemicals. They're all having to be detoxified by the bee's immune system. But in addition to being detoxified, we don't know to what extent, like, this much of chemical A and this much of chemical B doesn't necessarily equal the sum of it, but it could equal 3 times the sum of it. We don't know anything about that. So I just went away from that meeting. I was shaking my head all the way home and ever since. Like, I could not believe it. And it wasn't the only study like that. There have been several that bees are getting a lot of chemicals. So, some of them we thought were benign, like fungicides. And then it turns out when you combine that benign fungicide with another chemical, it turns out it's really bad. And so,
now I'm pissed off. Thanks.
And so colony collapse, well, we don't know exactly what colony collapse disorder was. That was the big buzzword 10 years ago, and colonies were just dying everywhere. Yeah. It seems to have dropped away, not quite the same. But we still have annual mortality of beehives in the range of 20-25%. Last year in Ontario, I think the average was 50% of bees died over the winter. Bees meaning bee colonies. Okay. And you don't just start up a new colony with just buying a single queen bee or something. You know, it takes a whole bunch of worker bees and a queen and a lot of money. And we had our biggest beekeeper in the province of Ontario, largest scale. He didn't weigh 400 pounds himself, but he was a large scale beekeeper. He had about 7,000 hives, and he lost 90% last winter. And I don't know. I haven't heard if he's in business still this year, if he managed to recoup his losses, or
did he know why?
No, we really don't know why. Part of it seemed to be, at least part of it, that there was a warm spring, and the mites seemed to have maybe gotten an extra generation of reproduction.
Yep.
And a generation of mites means like a tripling of mite numbers. So you can imagine starting off the spring with a small group of worker bees and a small group of mites. And the worker bees reproduce really quickly. And the mites are kind of tracking along. You can't see them. Tracking along behind. And then the mites keep going up, and the bee numbers start to go down in the fall, but the mite numbers are still going up. All of a sudden, you've got like a mite on every 2 bees or something. And if you have too many mites, it's just your bee colony won't survive the winter. So, we should talk about something more pleasant. What else do you want to talk about?
There's nothing pleasant left, my friend. There's just nothing. I can, dogs are cute. I don't know.
But the good news, I guess, is that there are some populations of honeybees in the wild that are coming back. Those Africanized bees that I got my start with bees with tend to be they have a whole suite of characters that make them more resistant to these mites. And so in a lot of tropical areas in like Mexico, south into Brazil, the bees really are not affected so much by the mites anymore. They had enough traits that allowed some resistance, and those have now been amplified. And now the bees are not that are surviving now are not so badly affected by the mites. And even in some temperate areas, there are some areas where the bees have come back into the woods where they used to be absent. So bees are pretty resilient. They are coming back. We're not going to lose our bees like there were dire threats of extinction of bees. No, bees are not going to go extinct, but they're definitely under harm.
Yeah. So, and as far as, and there's all these possibilities that they evolutionarily could adapt to certain horrible conditions that they're living in. But should we just be maybe not dumping so much poison on everything all the time?
That'd be lovely.
Yeah.
Yes. I think we always need to work toward friendlier solutions to pests. But that being said, if you're a grower and you got a serious pest that's decimating your crop for the year, what do you do?
Right.
That's a tough balance.
Yeah. There's
an interesting thing that's emerged now that I just have been hearing about. So our European honeybee that was native to Europe got introduced to Australia years and years and years ago, of course, and several projects have documented that those managed honeybees had a negative impact on the native bee fauna. So by the native bee fauna, just to put it in perspective, we have in Ontario alone, my province here, which is fairly far north, we've got over 450 different kinds of bees that live in this little, well, it isn't a little place, but in this part of the world. And only one of those is a honeybee that was brought from Europe. So you bring that bee from Europe here, and they live in big colonies with, say, a colony of bees over the course of a season is almost certainly going to raise at least 1,000 baby bees. And so if they're taking the food, the pollen and the nectar for 1,000 baby bees, that ought to translate into somewhere in the wild bees that are out there, a lot fewer of them, right? There's only so much food goes around at the table. And we can manage our bees to get them through bad periods and stuff like that. And the wild bees can't have no management. They just have to eke it out. So there's a contingent. Oh, and there's some evidence now that some of these diseases that honeybees have may actually be moving from managed bees out to wild bees in the environment too. So that's
right.
Yeah. So there's a contingent that is like anti-honeybee now that wants to go out and kind of like eliminate honeybees and, I don't know, go back to the good old days or something, without, I think, realizing the extent to which how many of our crops are pollinated by those managed honeybees. Like they are literally the one bee that's really easy to pick up by the thousands and thousands and move overnight into a crop for pollination. And then move them out like 2 weeks later when you need to spray a pesticide or something. Like the numbers of honeybees that can be moved in quickly, to pollinate a crop there's nothing that matches that.
Wow.
So, this is an issue that's come up just recently, and some colleagues of mine are launching an initiative to try to bring more focus onto this problem because there's no doubt that there are some issues, but the solution isn't getting rid of all honeybees, especially in Europe. They're native to Europe. So how do you get rid of a native bee? It's part of the natural fauna.
Yeah. So what we talked about, the diversity part of biodiversity, which is, stronger because we have a variety of kinds. Yeah. Well,
I don't know if there's any evidence that honeybees per se have driven any other species to extinction. But that would be a hard thing to get evidence for. If you have some rare species and you make them even rarer, and then they go extinct, who do you point the gun? Who do you point the finger at? Where's the smoking gun? There's no smoking gun, but the finger kind of winds around and it points toward the honeybee. There's no doubt about that.
If the wild aspect is strong enough to defend itself against the honeybees, but if the honeybees were just aggressively more invasive and stronger and more competitive, then who knows?
But see, honeybees, one of the things going full circle here, when I first started to get involved with honeybees, what drew me in was their phenomenal social systems, their societies. And as probably most people who watch this video will know, honeybees have this amazing communication system where a bee can find food at a flower or a patch of flowers, and it can go back to its nest, its colony, and through its movements in the colony and the odor that's clinging to its body, it can literally send its sisters right back out to that same general vicinity to collect that food quickly. We don't have any other bee in North America or in Europe that has that ability to recruit their sisters to quickly take advantage of a food source. So that makes them an incredibly fierce and potent competitor against the wild bees that all have to go out there and each one individually on its own look for food, bring it in, go look for food again, bring it in. They don't have the advantage of this social communication to share the information and to act upon it to work as a collective. So I specifically focus there in North America and Europe because as soon as you get into the tropics, there's a whole group of bees called stingless bees that, and there are many, many species of stingless bees around the world. And they also can communicate just different ways and to different extents the location of food to their sisters. Some of them very complexly and some of them less so. But in the temperate regions and the colder regions where those stingless bees don't live, even bumblebees that live in colonies don't have the ability to they can excite their sisters and say, oh, there's good food out there and it smells like this. But then after that, the other bees have to go out and go, wow, I'm excited. I want this food. But I just got to sniff it out, right? And that's not nearly as efficient as being told, oh, head 3 blocks that way and 1 block to the left and you'll hit the Burger King and you can get your food. The honeybees can really direct their sisters.
Sound like the Americans of the bees, just.
I won't go there.
I can. All right. Well, we'll leave it there. We're going to have you back. Absolutely. We only covered probably 1% of what you know about your topics there. I want to thank Gard Otis for coming. University of Guelph, School of Environmental Science. Wonderful human being, entomologist, bug nerd like me. Anything you want to add before we go?
If anybody's watching this video and they've never spent some time watching honeybees, find somebody who has a hive of bees and just go and sit a couple feet away on a nice spring day and enjoy the warmth of the sun and the smells of the flowers and watch those bees. And after 30 or 40 minutes, if you haven't started to become drawn into their world, I have no hope for you.
Yeah, that goes for me too, you bastards out there. Yeah, wonderful. Well, we'll talk after this, but we'll say goodbye to everybody. Thanks for coming, everybody. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.